Good afternoon, and thank you all for joining us today during our EDI Week 2024 keynote event for this year, which we are using also to commemorate International Women's Day. My name is Dr. Melinda Smith, and I'm the Vice Provost and Associate Vice President Research for Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion. And it is my distinct pleasure to welcome you to this webinar. EDI Week is in full swing since the 4th. And so I'm so happy that so many faculty, staff, postdocs, students, community members, people across Canada are joining us in these offerings here at University of Calgary, which is a part of our commitment to educating for the public good and for making our events as open and accessible as possible. On this webinar, we want to mark International Women's Day, the theme for which is inspiring inclusion. International Women's Day can be traced back to the early 1900s, but was recognized by the UN in 1995 as an international day on March 8th. So we're celebrating it early. In fact, we should be celebrating it all year. Importantly, it has its roots in the international labor movement. Give us bread and roses. Today, it is used for reflection, for celebration, for advocacy, and to acknowledge the ongoing efforts to improve the status of women and girls in all spheres of life, whether it's education, whether it's pay equity, whether it's care work, access for equal opportunities, including leadership in parliament, on the judiciary, corporate boards, in municipal government, parliament, in university as full professors or university leaders, whether department heads, deans, senior leadership teams or executive teams. This is a moment for us to think about the status of women in all these spheres and to insist that women are equally able and should be better reflected in these spaces. Before we start today's program and go into more details about the topics that we are assembled here to hear, and the speakers we assembled here to hear, I would like to take this opportunity to acknowledge the traditional territories of the people of the Treaty 7 region in southern Alberta, which includes the Blackfoot Confederacy, comprising the Siksika, the Piikani, and the Kainai First Nations, as well as the Tsuut'ina First Nations and the Stoney Nakoda, including the Chiniki, Bearspaw, and Goodstoney's First Nations. The city of Calgary is also home to the Métis Nation of Alberta Districts 5 and 6. I'm honored to welcome each of you who are here to this webinar and three outstanding women who are joining me today for the programming. Dr. Rachel Zellars is an associate professor at St. Mary's University. Will be bringing her expertise in Black migration and the Black Atlantic and slavery, and her pioneering work on the Canadian Public Service. She's also a scholar of critical race theory and Black feminism, and is award-winning, having been recognized for her teaching and research. And also is deeply and profoundly committed to social justice and grassroots organizing. Thank you, Dr. Zellars, for taking the time to share your knowledge and expertise with us at University of Calgary and today. Also joining us is my esteemed colleague, Dr. Shawna Cunningham. Dr. Cunningham is University of Calgary's acting Vice Provost for Indigenous Engagement. Previously, she served as the Director of Indigenous Student Center, which is now the Writing Symbols Lodge, and has been with the university for over 20 years, bringing decades of experience, Indigenous post-secondary education, Indigenous ways of knowing, expertise in Indigenous student services, as well as director of our Indigenous strategy Etapato implementation. So thank you, Dr. Cunningham, for joining us. Finally, I would like to introduce Elder Colleen Sitting Eagle, a Siksika language instructor who has worked with the Siksika culture and heritage since 1992. We are pleased to call Elder Colleen Sitting Eagle a UCalgary alumni and invite her to start us off with a blessing. Elder Colleen Sitting Eagle.
Okay, kitkoneeksi matsim puanoksissikui. Nistuoksipianat kuminita katsimui. I'll do my prayer, my blessing, and I'll give you just a brief comment on today's talk, and I have to get back to my students. I'm in the middle of the lunch break. Ayo apsitukia noknokin nessamukinan. O kikim nokokamutsipiukinan nokapoistamatsukinan kanesukapi. Ayo apsituki kanextikus kiten katsimatpinan. Okiamuksa kiksa kukitsa ispipu uaya. Okinisnan sikawaka tu sikawa awatu imanan kiks. Okikimma tus nukusik so yonitana nisukusik. Okyon nukpatsimui. Aks nukan poatsimukak maskut kahia itamenoya utskimmanua weks. Okikimatu kinananuksis akitsista pesukapi annumnita oksinan. Okakitsootsitsipaamasi seipumapis saasis tunatapis. So I greet you all, and I was listening to the topic, Women's Day. In our culture, in the Siksika culture, we hold our women very high. And to this day, I'm honored to say that we've kept up that cultural belief in holding a Siksika woman, I guess, on a high pedestal. Because if not for women here in Siksika, we would not have ceremonies. We would not have events. A lot of our ceremonies are started by the women. There is a women's society that starts all our ceremony, our sun dances. In Siksika, we call it Agukatsin, circle camp. The sun dance is a totally different thing where a woman vows her life for 4 days in sacrifice to whatever she placed her vow on. Many of the women that vow go back many, many thousands of years. In fact, my grandmother vowed 6 of these sun dances. So just so to clear that word, a sun dance is a sun dance when a woman vows for a very important reason, whatever reason it may be. A circle camp, Agukatsin, is the camp that holds all the ceremonies, all the society dances. But to start off these ceremonies, these circle camps, the Women's Society, the Buffalo women, are the ones that start off this whole 2.5 week event that's held every summer. They prepare from the time the circle camp is over to the next year. They celebrate equinox. They celebrate different things within the year to prepare for this time. So again, our women are very highly respected. But then you look at the Western world, we're looked upon as just a woman. In many cases, that's what we are. We're the mothers, we're the daughters, we're the sisters. But a lot of times we're not included in a lot of things, like women weren't allowed to vote. women weren't allowed to do many things in different cultures, but things are changing, and I'm happy for that. So I speak on behalf of the Siksika women. I speak on behalf of all of you. My prayers included all of you. To greet your family that you've left at home this morning, you'll greet them with open arms. If you and just to protect you for throughout the day, to make things happen, positive things to happen in our world. So that's just a little bit of my little comment that I wanted to give, and I wish you all the best. I will listen in and out today while it's going. Like I said, I have to get back to my students. Thank you.
Elder Sitting Eagle, I want to thank you very much for taking the time, as you usually do, to join us for our webinars and for opening us up with a blessing in a good way, and for your insights, which I think are a wonderful way to set off this conversation. So thank you very, very much. And we look forward to any contributions you make throughout this webinar. Thank you.
Thank you.
We'll share this with you. Thank you. I'm honored to start off our International Women's Day presentation with just a few brief remarks on engendering equity beyond tokenism and symbolic inclusion. As a reminder, we will be hosting a Q&A period at the end of the presentation by myself, Dr. Zellars, and Dr. Cunningham. So be sure to continue adding your questions throughout the presentations to the Q&A. As I mentioned in the outset, the theme for International Women's Day 2024 is inspiring inclusion. The term inclusion is ubiquitous, like the terms equity, diversity, and accessibility. But they invite us to reflect on the research, on the scholarship, the teaching, the engagement. We know the research is pretty clear about the ways in which equity and inclusion fuels ingenuity. It sparks creativity. It fosters innovation. It leads to not only faster and better problem solving, it leads to better decision making. It leads to better community engagement. In the corporate sector, there's abundant research to highlight that equity, diversity, inclusion leads to greater profitability, leads to greater productivity, leads to niche markets. If that's true, what's the catch? Because in every sector, there is an underrepresentation of women, racialized minorities. So we think intersectionally, Indigenous peoples, lesbian, gay, bisexuals, transgender, queer, persons with disabilities. That the research is clear. This is true on corporate boards, where women make up a small percentage of board membership, and the numbers are barely noticeable for racialized and Indigenous peoples. And in other cases, the data isn't even collected on persons with disabilities and lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer. True underrepresentation in Parliament. Canada has one of the lowest percentages in the world. We are around 50 in the world, with just 30% representation. In Parliament, we are underrepresented as university professors, full professors, and in university leadership. Certainly among presidents, the number has never gotten more than 30%. Similarly, if you look at women of color, racialized women, Indigenous women, the numbers are too small to report, meaning we have not moved the dial. So this International Women's Day calls for us to think about the meaning of inclusion, what we mean by it, and why it's so ubiquitous, despite the fact that we have not moved the dial. And I want to stress that, when the Royal Commission on the Status of Women was launched in the 1967 to inquire into and report on the status of women in Canada and to recommend what steps might be taken by the federal government to ensure equal opportunities for women in all aspects of Canadian society. That was the 1970 that it brought in its report, calling for the very same things we are highlighting today: equality in employment, equal pay for equal work, reproductive rights, equity in care work. We've been engaged in since the Royal Commission on Equality in Employment in 1984, which came in to inquire into the most efficient and effective and equitable means of promoting employment opportunities, eliminating systemic discrimination, and assisting all individuals to compete for employment opportunities on an equal basis. Since 1984, the Abella report has come out, and here we are in 2024, making the same kinds of arguments, making the same calls for equity in employment, equity in pay, equity in leadership that was being made in 1967, 1984, and again in 2024. So inclusion has become ubiquitous in organizations, and organizations are declaring themselves committed to diversity, committed to equity, committed to inclusivity. So this theme inspires us to say to organizations, to ourselves, because not just organizations, we are part of organizations. How do we move beyond the talk to the practice, to the lived reality, where we embody what we say, whether we live it, we practice it in the everyday, so that we walk the talk, to make core values a practice. And we know the benefits of it already, as I've suggested to you. So I also want to mention then that we need to move beyond tokenism and symbolic inclusion. Equity, diversity, and inclusion they're hard work. They require us to do things differently. They require us to disrupt groupthink and to transform those who are around us, not just to open doors, but actually to make sure people have a seat at the table and a voice and representation. Yet there are many tables in our universities, in our corporate boards, in Parliament that do not have diversity of people, ideas, and perspective, despite the benefits. So this is what leads to this whole discussion about tokenism. Werner Saint-Denis, a renowned EDI advocate, says, diversity is inviting everybody to the party. Sure, you invite it. No matter who you are, come. Equity is making sure that everyone has the ability and resources to get to the party and get inside the door. Inclusion requires a little bit more. It's been asked to dance or offered refreshments, but that's act of inclusion because you have to be asked to come in, to be offered something. Is an act of power. So when we do not see inclusivity, people are exercising power not to include, and in fact, to maintain the status quo of exclusion or marginality. So inclusion requires intentional action and commitment to go beyond the talk, to actually engaging in action to transform non-inclusive spaces or spaces that only include people like ourselves, birds of a feather, to making sure that people who are not like ourselves, who are historically and traditionally not at those tables, are actively encouraged and empowered to be at those tables. The idea of hitting what is tokenism is thinking about hiring an employee from an underrepresented group. But that's not diversity. I mean, that's just additive. That's tokenism. Oh, we have one of those. Oh, we gave you a job. We gave you an opportunity. That's disrespectful in a way. Tokenism is a symbolic effort to hire a small number of people from an underrepresented group and gives the appearance that there's equality within the workplace, but not necessarily, because it begs the question about where those individuals are, what roles they are in, and how they are treated once they are in those roles. So there are efforts to appear diverse in order to prevent criticism, appear diverse because the laws requires it. You can say employment equity requires us to do something. But those who are in those roles are not empowered in a way, in a meaningful way. This leads to tokenism, this leads to frustration, and this is what we are trying to change, and what the theme for International Women's Day sparks us to reflect upon. Tokenism is devastating for those who experience it, and we have the power and the resources to change it. So I wanted the way to avoid tokenism, to think about one more quote about tokenism. Tokenism is diversity without inclusion. It's perfunctory. It meets numerical goals. It creates the appearance of diversity without making effective change. The status quo remains. The system and structures and culture don't change. It's just additive, but not transformative. Tokenism can lead to hiring for the wrong reasons as well, in reaching numbers, numerical goals. But much more needs to be done to talk about meaningful inclusion, respectful inclusion, where we value not just the existence of people, we value the ideas, the perspective, the knowledges, the ways of knowing and being that they bring to the table. Inspiring inclusion invites us to think beyond tokenism in symbolic inclusion. So if you want to think even deeper, inclusion requires us to think about how we draw on the diversity of people and ideas and perspectives and ways of knowing to create a fairer, a better, a healthier, high-performing university, corporate board, parliament, where all individuals are respected. They experience a sense of psychological safety. They experience a sense of respect. But where that space, that inclusive space, enabled by inclusive leaders, helps them to become more motivated, helps them to think about contributing more to the institution, the organization, helps them to think about, helps them to experience a sense of being valued. So inclusion actually requires more. Belonging is the combination of these things where people are not just respected and included, but their contributions, who they are, they can bring their full selves to the institution and not have to engage in code switching, not have to engage in hiding who their identities or who they are or their opinions for fear of being censored or even being expelled from the body politic. Inclusion and belonging is what this day is about, and it's what we, in this kind of portfolio, EDI week, and activities are engaged. It's what it's about, helping us to do things differently. Because if we're doing things the same way and expecting a different result, we are deluding ourselves. So with this, I want to now turn the floor over to our colleagues so that they can offer their contributions. But I would want to end then just by saying this. Inclusive leaders can be influential in shaping an organization, in shaping a culture of an organization, and sparking curiosity about people who are different from the majority and ourselves. They help us to be more empathetic. They help us to think critically about the capabilities and the contributions people who are different from ourselves bring to the table. They help us to disrupt the status quo. That to me is easier said than done, but to me, it is the challenge of the theme for International Women's Day, and it is part of the ongoing work of EDI Week 2024. So with those introductory remarks, I'd like to turn the floor now over to Dr. Shawna Cunningham, my colleague and Vice Provost, Indigenous Engagement, who will speak on inclusion in organizational structures and Indigenous perspective. Dr. Cunningham.
Wow, thank you so much. I'm just going to go ahead and share my screen here. So just give me 1 second. Thank you. First of all, I want to thank our elder, Colleen Sitting Eagle, for a beautiful prayer, and Melinda for your inspiring words that really lift us up as women and as leaders across this country, and really inspire us to look for a more inclusive space for strategic populations, for various different groups, to increase the diversity and knowledge at all of the organizations that we work for. Nitanako mistoit biksaki. My name is Shawna Cunningham. That is my Blackfoot name, and it was gifted to me by Elders Reg and Rose Crowshoe. I'm very honored for that name because it ties me to the place that I was born, ties me to the Crowshoe family, and it ties me to my own identity as well. I am Métis Cree from Southern Alberta. I was born and raised in Southern Alberta, but my ancestral ties and family are all from Northern Alberta, from the Lesser Slave Lake region, from St. Albert, from Lac St. Anne. I have a strong Métis history here in Alberta, and it's an honor to be here today and to be asked to speak. I have some slides I just want to go through, and certainly open to some questions after as well. So I'll just move forward, and I want to start by honoring our grandmothers. And I would like to open up the presentation by saying that, you know, in acknowledgement of International Women's Day, I embark on the topic of inclusion in organizational structures as I pay homage and tribute to those who came before. The caretakers of our communities, Indigenous women, grandmothers, mothers, sisters, aunties. I'm mindful of the role that Indigenous women have played in the history of Canada. And it's been noted that the economic development of this country was founded on the backs of Indigenous women from the time of European arrival through to the earlier explorers coming across this country, preparing hides for the fur trade, sustaining families and communities through the essentials such as food and clothing and shelter. I'm grateful for their strength and their resilience in the face of colonization, in the face of starvation and poverty and pandemics and epidemics and violent acts of racism and genocide. Indigenous women have historically and continue to play an important role in leadership and in ceremony, as noted by our elder today. In many communities, they are the decision makers, they are the healers, they are the caretakers of our communities. And finally, I remember as we embark on you know, moving towards International Women's Day, I remember and think about the murdered and missing Indigenous women across the country. their families and their children who continue to mourn their loss and pray for them. We're all here today in this world and at this time because we come from mothers and from grandmothers. And on this slide, I've honored my grandmothers and my family, and the matriarchs of our family, Sophie Chastelane, who was, from a fur trading company who resided in the Edmonton River Valley area with her husband, John Rowland, Rosalie Larondel, my grandmother's grandmother, who had Mohawk background, but was married to a fur trader and also lived in the St. Albert area, and lost her husband early on in her life and had 14 children to raise on her own, and was very active in the Métis community in the St. Albert region. And then my grandmother, Mariah Cunningham, who you see there on the left in her first communion, she went to the residential day school in the St. Albert area and was taught by the great nuns. I honor those women before me because they paved the way for me to become the woman that I aspire to be throughout my life. So I wanted to pay tribute to those women before we talk about inclusivity. Truthing, I think it's so important as we embark on conversations around inclusivity and around the role of women in our society, to also, look forward to concepts around reconciliation. And I feel like in some cases we move to reconciliation without thinking about what truthing means. And truthing in our community is just as important as reconciliation. Truthing acknowledges our colonial past. It acknowledges acts of genocide that have, impacted Indigenous peoples across this country for many years, cultural genocide and overt acts of genocide. Colonization has been a violent experience for Indigenous peoples. And the violence has carried on through intergenerational trauma. Indigenous peoples were exposed to violent acts of genocide through the residential school system, violent acts of abuse, sexual abuse, psychological abuse, spiritual abuse as part of the legacy of the residential school system. And we currently live, and people forget this, that in Canada, we live in a legislative state of colonization. Colonization has not gone away. It is with us today. We have legislation that keeps us in a state of colonization through traditionary relationships with provincial, federal government, and through the Constitution of Canada, and through the Indian Act and other legislation. And through those legislations, we are marginalized and continue to be marginalized and oppressed through legislative state of colonization. We experience social cultural disparity in our communities, and we also experience racism, systemic racism, and overt acts of racism that continue to occur across this country. So we're contending with what I call colonial residue. Colonial residue is what we live with, and what we've experienced in the past. We have assimilative legislation that has resulted in the loss of Indigenous cultures and belief systems, loss of Indigenous languages, loss of land, and loss of traditional lifestyle, and loss of life. These losses we are still grieving these losses. We're working, of course, through cultural resurgence to bring back Indigenous belief systems, cultures, and languages. And that's why our elders are so important to us. They hold, traditional knowledge of our people. We are dealing with systemic racism on a daily basis, ongoing acts of colonization and assimilation. We experience it and we feel it in our hearts. We understand what it feels like to be marginalized and oppressed, and silenced through decision-making processes and governing structures that have traditionally and historically excluded us. We experience the cultural oppression and the loss of cultural safety in these systems that are often founded on neoliberal and neocolonial structures. Overt racism still exists, the othering through Western education and knowledge systems, the state of power and privilege that is often invisible to those folks in the normative culture. We feel power and privilege, and it's a complex it's a complex ideology, and it's a complex process to understand where we sit and where we situate ourselves in the idea of power and privilege and the status quo, and the overt and violent acts of racism that are still impacting our communities. And I bring attention again to murdered and missing Indigenous women and children and boys across this country. The intergenerational trauma that is an ongoing state of social cultural disparity in our country. We live in a country where we have third worlds and First Nations communities where people do not have clean drinking water, where housing is inappropriate for weather conditions, where there's statistical inequities of death and suicide in education and employment, and there's poverty in our communities. There's barriers to education and employment still. There's issues with retention in the K-12 system in Canada, and in academic preparedness of Indigenous peoples, and underrepresentation in higher education and other organizations. There's financial differentials between the federal and provincial education systems, and a lack of access to adequate finances for upgrading and post-secondary. These are ongoing. These are issues that we deal with on a day-to-day basis. We have lots of good relatives helping us deal, and work through these issues, but this is an ongoing state for our communities. These are some grounding documents that ground our work, that help inform our work and inform organizations across the country. The Royal Commission report on Aboriginal Peoples came out in 1996. It's very similar to the final report on Truth and Reconciliation, but also has some points of departure. The Royal Commission report on Aboriginal Peoples gives some very strong recommendations around changes that need to happen in this country in order for Indigenous peoples to thrive. The final report on Truth and Reconciliation has similar calls to action, which I feel are stronger. The final report of Truth and Reconciliation is a document of the people. It comes from the heart. It includes testimonials that are really important for Canadians to understand and to connect to the atrocities of the residential school system. The final report on Truth and Reconciliation calls us to action in many respects, in many sectors of our society. I think the important thing about the final report on Truth and Reconciliation is that people don't just move to the calls to action, but they actually read through the testimonials, read through, chapter 1, which is a history of Indigenous peoples in Canada, to really understand what truthing means before we take those steps towards reconciliation. And then United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples that Canada signed on to in 2015 is another important document, because it looks at Indigenous rights across the country, and it looks at how Indigenous people can be more respectfully included in all societies and treated, and that their lands and the integrity of their lands are protected. So this, really, when we start having this conversation about reconciliation, I think one of the important things that we need to sort of understand is that the lexicon or the language of reconciliation is ever changing and evolving. And we will find different definitions of these terms across, at various different organizations. When we talk about decolonization and indigenization, what does that mean for various different organizations? For decolonization and indigenization, my colleague Jacqueline Ottman says that decolonization is about a cleansing process and indigenization is a healing process. And those are all parts of reconciliation. Talk a little bit about resistance, because there is resistance to transformative reconciliation. I call that colonial resistance, but there's also resistance from Indigenous peoples to further acts of colonization. There's movements towards reclamation of Indigenous languages and lands. Inclusivity and cultural resurgence are ongoing acts where, Indigenous peoples are asking to be included, but shouldn't have to be asked or invited. That it becomes a fabric of our society. That inclusion isn't a conversation anymore. It just is. And that cultural resurgence is provided space in all organizations where Indigenous people do not have to leave, and others do not have to leave our culture at the door, where our cultures can thrive and be recognized. And that there is a sense of cultural safety in the organizations in which we work, that we feel that we can express our cultures in a safe way within these colonial structures. And then a sense of cultural humility, I think, is what our relatives bring to the table. Understanding that we cannot be competent in other people's culture, but we can come to the table with a sense of humility and a willingness and an open heart to learn about other people's culture, and to listen and to open up our hearts for, to a different way of knowing and doing and being and connecting. Some challenges, I think, in organizational structures that are really important that we're working through is that we still encounter denial. We encounter denial that there is racism, that there are inequities in our culture. And denial is a way to avoid change. There is resistance to meaningful inclusion, to including Indigenous voices. In some respects, there's also fear around change. And what we're, in the structures that we're most comfortable in are the structures that we wish to protect, but those structures also marginalize other. There's intercultural illiteracy across the country, that people do not take the time to understand and know the history of Indigenous peoples and languages and experiences in this country. And when we launched our Indigenous strategy, we actually had a survey that we had put out to the institution and had close to 2,100 responses. And it was very interesting to learn that we were basically in 2016 at ground zero when it came to our campus community's understanding or lack thereof of Indigenous people's history in Canada. I think we've moved the needle slightly, but we still have a long journey ahead of us. There's still a climate of conformity. And when I talk about a climate of conformity, there is pressure in many cases for Indigenous peoples to conform to colonial structures and to fit within those structures. And this really gets to conversations around meaningful inclusion, that we are not pressured to leave our cultures at the door. That, when we talk about low representation of Indigenous peoples and we look at representation versus meaningful inclusion, the question we ask ourselves often is, if we increase the number of Indigenous peoples and we invite them into organizations, but then ask them to follow the organizational structures, are we in fact creating a place of meaningful inclusion, or are we further colonizing other? And how can we find that parallel path in between, where there is there is some integrity around inclusivity as well? And looking at low representation of Indigenous peoples in all organizational structures is important, and moving away from quantification and in terms of how we allocate resources to indigenization, decolonization, and EDI overall. Indigenous peoples seldom win the numbers game. We're underrepresented. So when resources are allocated based on representation, we often don't get the resources that we need to be meaningfully included. So how do we move forward through intercultural capacity building and to increase meaningful inclusion in our campuses, to really, or in our organizations, is to look at truthing, to understand, what truthing means from an Indigenous lived experience. What is the truth of our history in Canada? How do we address reconciliation through education? All organizations have a responsibility and a call to action to create educational opportunities for the members of their organizations in order to move forward with inclusion. How do we increase cultural literacy of our organizations through education? How do we address systemic resistance And when we feel that resistance within our organizations, that's a resistance to change. And how do we address that? How do we create opportunities for Indigenous peoples to engage in organizational structures in a meaningful way? It's through an ethical space of engagement. This comes from the work of Willie Ermine, who talks about the importance of dialogue and the importance of individuals across all organizations situating themselves to become good relatives and allies of Indigenous peoples. Relational structures are problematic, and for many people from other cultures, hierarchical structures often exclude other. Indigenous communities are based on relational structures where all of our relatives are included, where we're all there's equality, there's voice, there's room for even the smallest voice. I put the picture of the bee in this slide simply because there's stories around the importance of the bee, and even though the bee is a very small being in our world, has a really significant and important voice in the ecosystem of the world. Our structures are very relational versus transactional in how we connect and relate to one another in the circle of all our relations. And all our relations isn't about human beings, it's about the whole ecosystem and how we all interconnect and interact with each other in order to create a healthy and equal space of inclusion. So I put this slide up here because I wanted to talk a little bit of what does inclusion look like. Some really important sayings that have come from an Idle No More movement was nothing about us without us. Nothing about us without us is really about including Indigenous peoples in decision making. It's about pushing back on government and government systems where Indigenous peoples have not had a say over their communities, over their lands, and within their education system. So it's really calling on for the dismantling of decision making where Indigenous people have been left out. Yes, Indigenous people need to be at the table when discussing matters that directly impact them or us. We need to have a voice at the table. That is intentional inclusion that requires a decolonized mindset that values the expertise and knowledge that Indigenous people are bringing to the table. We come with a different lens that I think is of value to transformative reconciliation and to how our knowledge systems will expand ways of doing, being, knowing, and connecting, and add value to organizational structures. So it's looking at Indigenous presence, embodied indigeneity as both presence and present or gift to organizational structures. It's looking at a relational way of being, embodied presence where we bring our Indigenous selves to the table, our true selves, in order to participate in resurgent practices where our cultures can thrive and add value to the country and society as a whole. It's about ethical relationality in a shared space. Spaces and places that are significant to us in this country, that we offer, good hospitality to all who come into our presence through an ethical space of engagement where all voices are welcome, where one culture does not attempt to take over another, where we do not have debates about who is right and who is wrong, but that we sit together in a circle to understand the different perspectives that we bring to the table. It's about trans-systemology, which is how Indigenous peoples and others have to navigate the space in between two cultures, how we navigate neocolonial systems in order to find that ethical space and to engage our relatives in the organizations in which we work, and how we look at that space in between, which we create either a positive or negative experience for others. And knowing that when we invite Indigenous peoples into our organizations, we are creating a lodge for them, and that lodge needs to be ethical and safe in order for us to participate. So I want to just thank everyone for listening. I'm going to stop sharing here and turn things back over to Melinda. So thank you.
Thank you so very much, Dr. Cunningham, Shawna, for that really insightful presentation, and for pushing our thinking in further, I think, in a good way, and for asking the tough questions that need to be asked, and hopefully inspiring some insightful reflection on relationships and the meanings of indigeneity, reconciliation, decolonization, in terms of Indigenous peoples. So I'm always inspired listening to you, and so thank you for bringing that. I'm glad others have the opportunity to hear you. At an institution where diversity is said to be our strength, embracing diverse thoughts, including engaging and including and incorporating Indigenous voices and perspectives and ways of being and knowing is an ongoing work of all of us. And so I want to thank you for being with us on that journey as we pursue the parallel paths. So thank you for that. So I encourage you to keep putting your questions in the box for Dr. Cunningham. Now I would like to invite Dr. Zellars to the stage, the virtual stage. Dr. Rachel Zellars will speak on 2 myths, merit and Black exceptionalism.
Hello, everyone. Can you see, you can see, I'm assuming you can see what I can't fully see. Thank you to Dr. Smith, to, of course, Elder Colleen, Sitting Eagle, and Dr. Cunningham for just grounding us and getting us started. So thank you. I'm really looking forward to the Q&A portion of our time together. A few years ago, I became a little bit obsessed with merit. I was working in an environment where, for the first time, merit meant something really important. I had taken up a research fellowship in Canada's public service at a time when it was undergoing enormous structural change, just like all of these other institutions. And I realized a child is going to run through the door, and I'm going to pause and open my door. Oh, the joys of working from home. I had taken up a research fellowship in Canada's public service at a time when, like so many other institutions, Canada's public service was undergoing enormous structural change in response, of course, to the execution of George Floyd. And it created something called the call to action. Maybe you've heard of it, maybe you haven't. And it was its government-wide attempt to address systemic racism within our nation's largest employer. In public service, merit, as I came to learn, looks a little bit different than it does in the rest of the world. Merit usually means somebody gets their position or their job because they're best qualified. They've got the qualifications and they earn that job. But in public service, there's something called a competition. It means that someone took a test, a competition, and they competed against others at their level, and they won that competition. There's some exceptions, but generally that's how it works in public service. And this way that merit applied is called the merit principle or the merit system. And so when I first arrived to public service, one of the things that really struck me and attuned my ear to merit is I kept hearing all of these questions. Questions like, well, why Black people now? Why is the call to action focused on Black people? Isn't this really a form of reverse racism or affirmative action? And what about qualified white employees who've been career public servants? Does the call to action mean that qualified white public servants won't have a fair opportunity? We've been here for decades. Aren't all of these diversity efforts also going to really lower the quality of public service, because they will not rely, in the context of hiring, on our merit system that's been established for so long. As someone who has spent literally a lifetime studying the way that whiteness behaves, particularly within institutional frameworks in this part of the world, you can imagine that I became very curious about these questions that, as an outsider to someone else's house, I was hearing again and again and again. Over the last century, whenever racial minorities in this part of the world have been perceived as obtaining gains specific to marginalized groups of people, gains specifically towards equality, or what are perceived as undue benefits by the majority, white resistance and violence has consistently followed. This is not hyperbole, but actually historical trend throughout North America, right? Throughout North America, and it has a name. As academics, we call it white backlash. It's a pattern that can be traced in North America for over a century. I said a century, but well over a century. And so a couple years ago, when this call to action was launched, those questions that I was hearing did not strike me as abnormal as much as they did really interesting in light of what was happening. So at this time, the call to action was presenting some really steadfast demands for Black inclusion and leadership in public service for the very first time in public services history. And of course, this document, this call to action, if you will, became very, very threatening to the status quo. All of those questions that I mentioned just a moment ago, they relate back to one thing, which is this issue of merit. One that is foundational, as I mentioned, to public service. And so I started in my fellowship reading back about 100 years to figure out what was going on. What did this merit principle that meant something specific in terms of how public servants get hired into public service, what did that mean exactly in relationship to what was also happening in the aftermath of the execution of Brother George Floyd? In the process, I learned a lot. And I began to understand why all these questions were being presented, were coming forth. And I'll share just 3 things that I learned at that time. I learned first and foremost that this merit principle that so many people had presented to me as something fixed in stone is really just a guiding idea about who best belongs in public service. It has never, ever been fixed in stone. In fact, although many leaders in public service to this day would tell you that it is. It's something that creates a very clear way of doing things. That's absolutely not true. In fact, over the last century, the merit principle, this bedrock of public service, has been malleable. It's been unstable. It's been actually used as well in a intentionally discriminatory fashion during the First and Second World War. And it's been used to make place for people, for groups of people that our nation's largest employer has excluded in the past. As it turns out, public service actually has a long history of things like preferential hiring, affirmative action, and I would argue even quotas. In fact, the very first quota system in public service was something called the patronage system, one that assured the dominance, of course, of white Canadian men in public service through favoritism, payoffs, nepotism. But we don't do that in Canada anymore. It's some old stuff, right? A second thing that I learned is that public service has always been committed to white bodies as the norm, and then initially white male bodies, but at a certain point in time, through the advocacy of second wave feminists in the 1960s, white women too. In fact, as historian David Benoud wrote in his dissertation, 19th century liberalism actually depended on healthy white male bodies that could work, consume, govern themselves and others. And these ideal liberal bodies were the same ones that made up Canada's public service. Thirdly, I learned how hard public service has worked over the last century intentionally, right? Intentionally to keep public service as white as possible, and specifically to ignore its unjust treatment of Black Canadians as Black Canadians were growing in demographic share throughout our country. And I'll give you just three historic examples to really bolster these 3 points that I've introduced to you. The first is the World War, right? I mentioned these briefly. One of the things that we know with respect to our nation's largest employer is that after the First World War, veterans coming home from the war were given preferential hiring access, particularly disabled veterans. This is very, very important. And they were given preferential hiring access for jobs in public service. This created 55,000 positions for veterans. And we also, at the same time, know from the work of historian Kathy Grant that between 3,000 and 4,000 Black Canadians served in our First and Second World Wars, right? Because this preferential hiring schema stretched through the Second World War. But we also know that these veterans, right, these Black veterans were not considered for these 55,000 jobs, this preferential hiring schema that was created after the First and Second World War. We know that. There was one type of soldier that was considered best or qualified to benefit from this hiring schema that had been created, and that was white veterans, white soldiers, particularly white disabled men. A second historical point, right? We know that beginning in the 1950s in Quebec, the Quiet Revolution swept through Quebec and transformed its society culturally, socially, economically, spiritually, linguistically. It was a civil rights movement. It was a revolution in the province. And at the same time, we also know that public service listened very closely to what was happening on the ground in Quebec, and it responded in kind. It created a royal commission, and it responded by creating the very conditions that brought French speakers from Quebec into public service and leadership meaningfully, right? Not just French speakers, but white French speakers, white Quebecers, not Haitian Canadians, not French-speaking Black Canadians, but white Quebecers, not the thousands of Haitian professionals who were already during this time living and working in Quebec. And then finally, as has been alluded to today many times today, because of the reason we're together in the 1960s, right? 1967 in particular, public service literally moved mountains. I think of it as a moving mountain period in public service. Public service literally moved mountains to make space for women in public service. The Public Service Employment Act added sex to the grounds of prohibited discrimination, created an office of equal opportunity for women. Public service employed various forms of affirmative action to create programs for women. And it also created two historic reports on the status of women in public service, one called Sex in the Public Service, and the other by Kathleen Archibald, I believe that's her name, and then of course, another Royal Commission. The public service also set itself to increasing the number of women in public service, as well as the number of women into leadership positions in public service. And over time, through these reports, through its new programs, man, it succeeded. It absolutely succeeded. But at the same time, there were tens of thousands of Black Canadian women. They were organizers, they were mothers, they were domestics, they were also professionals. We know for a fact that these women were not included in these plans and these programs. We know that no briefs from Black women were included in the Royal Commission. on the status of women, not a single one. Black women were not enrolled in the Career Assistance Program, CAP, that was created for women in public service. No one cared whether or not Black women had volunteer experiences that could be rated in the same manner as other relevant experiences to allow women who had not entered the workplace to still qualify for positions in public service. Nobody cared about what Black women did in this country. Why does this matter? Why does this history matter? Particularly as it relates to the issue of merit, as I've been raising it. Well, because Black people know that history is not about the past, right? As the historian Ira Berlin used to say, it's never just about the past. History is yesterday and it is now. It is 1965 and it is now. And history teaches us that anti-Blackness is absolutely foundational to the history of our public service. This slide on the screen is from a fairly recent study from Harvard that concludes something kind of crazy. I find it a little bit crazy. It uses a large demographic sample of professionals. I think the number is 9,000, follows this group for 7 years. And just based on sheer numerical ratios, it finds or concludes that Black women who start in a workplace, start working in a workplace with a larger share of white coworkers, receive consistently lower performance evaluations that have, of course, direct impacts on turnover and promotion rates, right? Just having a larger share of white coworkers, right, has direct and negative consequences on the career outcomes of Black women, right? So the study doesn't, assert a causal analysis, but it does find an undeniable correlation between the two. More white coworkers equals worse career outcomes for Black women. This finding from this study from someplace else, south of the border, is confirmed again and again in a study that I'm currently leading in public service with an organization called BenRen, and I'm looking at the career experiences and barriers of Black executives within the federal public service. Over the last 6 months, I had the great fortune of interviewing 75 leaders, 1/3 of all Black executives in federal public service. Here's a snapshot of what that community looks like. There are about 9,000 executives in total, right, in public service, 190 Black executives. At parity, we know that this number should be closer to 400. It's not, of course. There's also a little bit of gender disparity in this group, with a larger share of Black female leaders than men. As a whole in public service, so what are we at, 375,000, but as a whole in public service, here's one thing that we know about Black public servants based on the research of Dr. Martin Nicholas. We know that Black employees are clearly overrepresented at the lowest levels, the lowest pay levels in government. That's a dark blue line that you can see is incredibly disproportionate in relationship to other groups. We also know that Black public servants are underrepresented, right? Underrepresented at the highest levels in government. Here are just a few key findings from my research with respect to career barriers. 50% of all Black executives detailed the ways that during their long careers, 20 years or more, they were explicitly denied important career advancing opportunities. Another, the denial of language training was reported by 42% of all Anglophone executives. This is huge. This is huge because you cannot become an executive in public service without being bilingual, right? And these are stories of white managers, white supervisors who said, no, we can't afford to send you on language training. It's too busy. We can't afford to lose you to language training. So it was a no. So of course that relates to long periods of career stagnation, which can also be traced. When these two things are combined, the great majority of Black executives in my study reported very explicit and effective career barriers. 35% of executives reported career stagnation periods of eight or more years. These are just a few of the main findings from my study. A few moments ago, I showed you that Harvard study regarding Black women, focusing on the career outcomes of Black women professionals. And unsurprisingly, in the study that I'm leading with Ben Wren, there are some remarkable findings as well regarding the career experiences of Black female executives. One is the very high level use of complaints, of grievances, and insubordination generally that are used as challenges to Black women's normative leadership responsibilities. That's really important, meaning these complaints and grievances are not substantiated once the investigation has happened. They're simply used as distractors, as a weaponizing strategy, if you will, to cast doubt and destabilize a new and increasing cadre of Black female executives in federal public service. There are many, many cases that are known inside and outside public service as well. During my interviews with Black women and men, both Black female and male executives took great detail to share the impacts of their career barriers on their well-being, on their mental health. Every single participant that I spoke to shared examples, many examples throughout a career with harassment, for example. Yet, Black women reported something distinct: dehumanizing conditions that often existed in their workplaces. And for some, these dehumanizing conditions led to suicidal ideations and suicidal attempts. I want to pause just for a moment to allow the weight of what I said to just sink in. Black women communicated a workplace environment where harassment was so persistent and so vicious that work led them to feelings of suicide and attempts. These are Black women with master's degrees, with law degrees, with MBAs, with PhDs. It should be no surprise that disproportionately the same group of executives have very high levels of education. These are Black women who've spent 20 or more years, careers, inside working for our nation's largest employer. These are Black women who are single mothers, who are daughters, who are caretakers of extended family members. And these are Black female executives who respond to my emails at 2 a.m. because that is when their day typically ends. These findings are shocking on their face, but they're even more shocking when one realizes that quite literally, there's nothing written about this topic in the scholarly material. These are stories that deserve to be heard. And I believe that there are more, including from Black men, including those that Black men have just not yet named. The most joyful part of the study for me is reading through my interview notes and grasping the full weight of how Black leaders describe their leadership values, especially in light of all the other stuff, right? The career barriers, of which there are so many. Their responses are gorgeous. In fact, they are the most gorgeous group of leadership values that I've heard articulated all in one place inside of public service. What kind of leader are you? I ask again and again. I open doors. I affirm and I encourage people. I'm a coach. I believe in the power of words and affirmation. I'm always going to empower my team and give them a safety net when they make mistakes. I'm a visionary. I'm humble. This one I love. I never think I'm the smartest person in the room. It amuses me because it comes from one of the most brilliant people that I've ever met in my life. And I have met quite a few. For these executives, leadership values are also tied to their cultural value system. I come from a big Guyanese family. We're smart and some are successful, but we shoot down guys in front of our family for not expressing humility. I learned growing up that humility is what keeps people in check, regardless of one's level of success. History shows us that public service has been experimental, it's been flexible, it's been resourceful, it's been adaptable for lots of other equity-seeking groups, for veterans, of course, for women, for French Quebecers, all who it imagined to be white. No Black veterans, no Black women, no Black French speakers, no disabled or neurodiverse Blacks, no Black Jews, no Black LGBTQ2+ public servants, only whites, only whites. And what was believed, what whiteness imagined to be true, became policy again and again and again. So, to answer one of those questions at the start, why Black people? Why Black people? Well, the answer is quite simple. Why Black people? Black people, because this history, our history, this history is why Black people now, today, every day, moving forward. Of course, things like affirmative action are needed for an entire inequity-seeking group that's been systematically denied, held back for over a century by our nation's largest employer. And yes, affirmative action, just like it was used for white veterans, for white women, for white Quebecers in our nation's history. And here's the thing that I know about Black excellence that I learned in the course of these interviews and over 1,000 other interviews with Black and racialized public servants. Excellence for Black folks is how our parents taught us to survive in an anti-Black world. And so Black presence and leadership in public service can only ever lift it up and make it twice as good, just as we have always done. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Zellars, for that tour de force, for that brilliant and insightful presentation. I'm looking forward to watching the video again so I can take in so much of it. But now we have about 10 minutes for questions. So I'm going to try to get as many of them in for you and Dr. Cunningham as possible. I think the little hearts that are going up and down are telling you enough about what people think about your extraordinary presentation and that of Dr. Shawna Cunningham, who I hope joins us. So I'm just going to give maybe 2 questions, so 3 questions. I'm going to combine them so that we can take in as many as possible. One, I'll begin with the TRC, Shawna, is if we witness truth and reconciliation action that appear to be aimed at diversity and inclusion of some sort, but doesn't include Indigenous voices, people, in decision-making at the table, as you suggested was necessary, nothing about us without us. How do you think about this? Is this tokenism? How do you respond to that? So that's one question. There are a couple other questions about, let me just see. So whether EDIA and Indigenous work as such can be seen as tokenism, or dismissed as tokenism, just by the way they are taken up in the academy or an institute in the public service, because they're not, can they be, as they are currently constituted, can they be seen as tokenism? And then Rachel and Shawna, do you have examples of organizations where there is a genuine commitment to combating anti-Black racism and fostering Black inclusion, where there are results? Do you know of any organization with proven results where the data shows other than what we are suggesting today? Who wants to start?
I can actually talk a little bit about Indigenous voices and decision-making. I think that when we look at hierarchical structures, minority groups are often underrepresented or necessarily, as the farther you move up an organization, the less representation you'll see. So what we're asking really is, as witnesses, as good relatives in this journey towards reconciliation, as Indigenous people, I think we have a responsibility to draw attention when we see exclusion or we see decision-making conversations where Indigenous peoples are impacted, but are not part of the conversation, and advocate for meaningful inclusion. Meaningful inclusion does not mean a checkbox consultation. I think we need to move away from a structure where we consult, but we do not include. Meaningful inclusion means that there has, that the voice is there, but also that there's open heart to change and truly transformative changes within an organization. I always talk about softening the triangle with a circle, creating opportunities for dialogue, and moving away from systems that further oppress. So that's one piece of that I think is really important. Moving away from tokenism, I think that when we have strategies that, ideally in a utopic situation, we wouldn't have to have an Indigenous strategy or an EDI strategy, that would just become the fabric of our society, that inclusivity is natural, but that's not what's happening. So when we have these strategies, what's really important for implementation of the strategies is that they're alive, they're animate, that we treat them, that they have a spirit, and that we're all responsible for nurturing them and moving them forward. So that means there needs to be action associated. So now we're moving from reconciliation to reconciliation. And I think action is really important to keep those a momentum, and people need to take up a part of that. So it's not just for, say, Indigenous people to do all the heavy lifting, but that we all have a part of that reconciliation. Is there an organization? I would say there's First Nations organizations that are doing this work. Even in some cases, they are impeded by Western structures. But there are some restorative justice processes that I think are really doing a wonderful work with Indigenous peoples in the justice system. And there isn't really, I don't like the term, best practice. I think there's some wise practices emerging. So this is an emergent area. And I think it's also ensuring that we're checking back on how are we progressing. And it's not necessarily about the quantitative pieces, it's about the qualitative stories that are shared, the positive stories that are shared. I think that's really a good way to mark progress. So I'm going to stop there. I hope that's helpful.
Dr. Zellars.
I'm coming back. I'm taking notes, and because we're on computers, we don't write anymore as fast as we type, and I can't even read my chicken scratch. I'll give that answer a go. I'm going to take a big risk and say I think that public service is, I don't know if they're a great, let me not say maybe they're not the best example, maybe they're not even an example, but there is a bold experiment that has some substantial stuff. Here's what the substantial stuff is. I think there's a genuine commitment. I believe that. I do believe that. There was the call to action. We have so much disaggregated data. We'll have this wonderful qualitative study with lots of quantification stuff, not just stories floating around. For a long time, the stuff in the study was anecdotal, right? It couldn't be locked down and put into charts and graphs and numbers. We have stuff like the Executive Leadership Development Program, the first cohort created for Black and Indigenous leaders, that just last week there was a funding announcement made that would continue on for 3 years. The executive cadre that, the study is about has doubled in the last 3 years. And the first deputy ministers, women, Black women, they are scary brilliant, brilliant. I've also, there's been trainings to death. I happen to love talking about, I don't know, love is the right word. I like talking about implicit bias because I can thread it through history in ways that make a lot of sense and are very, very salient and clear. It's nothing abstract about it. By the time I'm done, I can provide really great action points based on good science. But what we do know is that, Frank Dubin at Harvard for many years has been raising the alarm, I think since the mid 90s, about the ineffectiveness and the backlash regarding diversity trainings broadly. So what I always say is that, institutional change and culture change, I don't know how you do it. If you just have, sticks and reprisal, I don't think you can create culture change that way. I think you have to have an education component built into it, but with the understanding that social value orientations vary within any organization. Not everybody is an ostrich or a dolphin. You got a whole bunch of sharks. So you have to design for all of those personality types. And I think, one of the things that I've learned, I know I'm rambling a bit, so you can shut me up here, but what I've learned, in this work over the last few years is we really, people with EDI work, we're good-hearted, good faith, empathetic people, and we design our stuff as if we only have dolphins and ostriches in our organizations. We forget there's a whole lot of sharks floating around. So anyway, training, yes. Can we measure impact? Let's try. Can we thread it through history in really material, localized ways? That's super important, and it has to be action-centered. So that's all I'll say about education. But yeah, I'm hopeful. All we have is, the infinite power of the state before us that we have to keep knocking against. We got to knock back. I'll just say one other thing, Dr. Cunningham, you started out talking about grandmothers. That is our responsibility, right? With this question of hope and struggle, I'm on the side of struggle. I don't know too much about hope. I know, but I believe it's a practice. I believe that hope is a practice. It's a muscle that has to be moved and practiced and exercised. But I'm on the side of struggle, and I'll keep struggling until I die. And I know that makes me and will make me a good ancestor one day. So I'll pause there. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And you in both of your responses, you touched on other questions about grandmothers and also about the last question I have, I know we are running out of time, is actually brings up this question probably about the sharks. How should we respond or react to opponents who position our work as woke racism that creates tries to create equity through advantaging one group or the other? So how do we respond to those who see efforts to create equity, reconciliation, uplift as a trade-off, a zero-sum game, so to speak? What's your response to that in the short time that is allotted to you? This is the current moment that we are in.
Dr. Cunningham?
I guess I think history is full of examples where one group tries to overtake another. And what I think we need to move to, and our elders talk about two canoes, that we can go down the river together in different canoes. And if those two canoes start to cross over, they're going to crash into each other and create chaos. It's a very symbolic response, but I feel like from Indigenous perspectives, we have a canoe. We didn't lack that. We didn't look to be overtaken. And we have, and now we live in this parallel world where our culture is just as important, needs to thrive and survive, that we can both go down the river in the same direction together and make progress and honor each other's path. I think finding that space in between, that parallel path in between, is where we need to land, so that, maybe we hand each other an oar once in a while, but that we're still, we can still respect and not feel the need to take over another culture. And so that would be my response. I know it's very symbolic, but I do feel like we are looking at that space in between those two canoes. Is that ethical space, or is it? we can create an ethical space. But it really is what we bring to the table, and knowing when we're overpowering and dominating another, that ethical space needs to stay equitable, and that's our role. We are responsible to creating that equitable space in between.
I appreciate that. Can I say something? It'll be 2 minutes. I'm sure that public service, you know, if it were to be studied, is comparable to many, many other institutions that float through, that exist in our country. Equity has always meant one thing, that the dominant group in history who has power has to give up some seats to make space for other groups, right? That's what equity has meant. And to study public service is to truly understand the ways in which, you know, at some point in history, white men, you know, they were the 95% threshold in government. They had to give up some seats to make space for white women. You know, Anglophones, white Anglophones in government had to give up some space during the Quiet Revolution to give space for, you know, white French Quebecers. The challenge will always be with us, because those groups don't want to give anything to Black and Indigenous people, which is why diversity work is forever work. We have to keep knocking and pushing. That's what that separates us out. But I don't know what else to say then. You know, we can't punch people in the nose. But I think we have to reckon with the reality of the resistance, the white backlash attaches to us, to indigeneity and Blackness. That is just a reality.
And I think it's important to also say that, you know, change is uncomfortable. And we are going to be in these uncomfortable places. We're going to be having uncomfortable dialogues. And that's okay. Because discomfort is part of the journey. And I think as if we can accept that as part of the journey, and accept that, you know, passion is fine, passionate causes are fine, and being uncomfortable at times is fine. We will get through that. And that's where I feel like the hope comes in, is that there is a better place to land and to be.
Well, I mean, I want to, we are out of time, and the hearts that are coming up speak volume for what people think about the extraordinary contributions both of you have made, Dr. Zellars, Dr. Cunningham, to this conversation, and Elder Colleen, Sitting Eagle, who started off in such a good way. So we are out of time, but I just want to take the opportunity to say, to extend my thanks to everything you have contributed to this webinar today. And in terms of thinking about meaningful inclusion and how that might inspire a deeper reflection on what inclusion should look like. But I think, and also what transformation would look like if we took it seriously and we moved beyond tokenism, or we moved beyond additive practices. And you're both correct that means that's a power conversation. It's also questions about domination, and about whether in fact we are going to unsettle that power in order to create spaces where more of us can thrive and go beyond surviving and get away from thoughts about suicide and identity. I mean, that should be heart-wrenching, should be a scar on the conscience of each person listening to it, that any institution that talks about equity, diversity, inclusion, indigeneity, reconciliation, that there are people who are smart, brilliant, want to contribute, but nonetheless feel like they're in those spaces. It is something for us to reflect upon and to change. So I want to thank you all for participating. I want to encourage people at U of Calgary and across the country. All of our EDI week events are open. You can register and attend. And I also want to thank those of you who know that the following week we will be hosting Professor Kimberly Crenshaw on the 18th, and we look forward to seeing you there as part of Courageous Conversation. So thank you to everyone. There's more information on UCalgary website, ucalgary.ca/equity-diversity-inclusion, and you will find EDI Week 2024 activities. So give it up to Dr. Rachel Zellars, Dr. Shawna Cunningham, and thank you, Elder Colleen, Sitting Eagle. Have a wonderful.
Thank you so much for having us.